Welcome. Welcome to this panel, the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance, taking action to scale up investment for the SDGs. I'm Mark Carney. I am the UN Special Envoy. I like saying that. The UN Special Envoy. Did you get that on tape? You'll hear from someone else from the UN in a moment for climate action and finance. And I'm joined by three eminent panelists, all very action-oriented, and that's what this is about. So we're going to get into it in a moment. Dr. Leila Fourie, who is the CEO of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and co-chair of the GISD. Dr. Jose Vinals, chair of Standard Chartered, but also co-chair of the GISD and well-known to us in international policy circles. And Sanda Ojiambo, who is head of Global Compact, and prior to that, quite an extensive business career, and so all sides of sustainable development, and we'll be able to bring all this expertise out. Now, I was given, I only have 4 minutes left, but I was given 5 minutes to speak. They tried to take it away from me just before I came in, but I'm going to use the 3 minutes and 45 seconds left to just say a few words. Look, as you may know, I focus on the easiest of the Sustainable Development Goals. And you know, it's true because climate is definitely hard, but it is eminently measurable, or at least the mapping from net zero to climate change is measurable. And so the ability to build up the elements to try to take action, which has not been easy, but is easier than it is in other regards. And we're going to have a chance to talk about 3 M's, measuring, mobilizing, and multiplying, scaling up, ultimately, climate action. And when I think about climate, and I'm down to 2 minutes now, when I think about climate, SDG number 13, of course it affects a series of others. 14, life underwater, 15, life on land, 6, clean water and sanitation, but also gender equality, number 5, the disproportionate effects, good health and well-being, no poverty, and beyond. And of course, number 8, economic, a decent economy. And that's, core point here is that it's all connected. All the SDGs are connected. There is no sustainability without sustainability, all aspects of sustainability. And the GISD and the members set themselves a much harder task, which is measuring, mobilizing, and multiplying solutions to achieve all 17 of the SDGs. So we're going to have a chance to hear directly from them in a moment, which I know is why you came. But first, we are going to hear from someone else who works at the UN, the Secretary General.
Dear friends, we are halfway to our deadline to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We are far from reaching our objectives. Poverty and hunger are increasing, so is inequality within and between countries. The war in Ukraine is fueling a triple food, energy and finance crisis. Climate catastrophe looms ever closer, with a massive scaling up and investment in sustainable development by countries, banks and businesses. And we need to make sure that funds are channeled to developing countries that need them most, including vulnerable middle-income countries. We need a radical transformation of the finance and investment ecosystem. The public and private sector will have to work much closer together to mobilize the necessary resources and align them with the SDGs and climate action. Multilateral development banks need to be urgently recapitalized. They need to increase efforts to mobilize and leverage private investment in the SDGs and expand the investment pipeline for sustainable development. And public and private decision makers need to take a long-term perspective that captures the interests of all stakeholders, present and future, and incorporates new measures of multidimensional vulnerability. This includes responsibility and accountability for ensuring that all investments are in line with the Paris Agreement goals of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius and building resilience to the climate disruption to come. I encourage you to build on your alliance's important work. Today's event can provide an urgently required boost for joint action by the public and private sector to scale up investment in sustainable development. Thank you.
I should say, in all seriousness, really commend his personal leadership and passion around these issues. Works absolutely tirelessly on them. As you heard, he called for a radical transformation of the financial system in order to achieve these goals and the necessity of public and private sectors working together. Just to give you a bit of a sense of the discussion, we're going to try and look at roadblocks and understanding those, and then secondly, how we can help overcome those obstacles, and then thirdly, help define a path forward. My goal would be to leave 15 minutes or so open for your comments and questions. So if you can think of them, I'm sure you came with some, but if they're not all answered in the interventions, fire away afterwards. Okay, so starting with roadblocks, and Jose, I'm going to start with you. You know, we're in a position where fiscal space is constrained because of the pandemic, because of the geopolitical situation. So how does that, you know, how do the public and private sector work together in that context, and what can the GISD Alliance do to help?
Okay, thank you very much. And two observations before I answer. One is that the thing that is a minimum common denominator in this panel, plus the Antonio Guterres in the screen, is having some UN association. So that's why we are here today. The second is that I'm sure that Mark will find the 15 minutes, because after having you as chair of the Financial Stability Board for so many years, I know you can deliver. I know you can deliver. Anyway, so in addition to being my regulator as governor of the Bank of England, which I will never forget, for the good reasons.
You were very well behaved.
Anyway, so coming back now to your question, and thanks very much for being here with us. It's really a pleasure. And a privilege to have you with us. So your question is, let me start from a fact, which is developing a bit what Antonio Guterres was saying. The annual financing gap for achieving the SDGs before the pandemic used to be $2.7 billion. Now it's gone up by 2.5. Now it's gone up by nearly $2 additional trillion. So we now have nearly $4.5 trillion per year of financing gap that needs to be covered. And as you were saying, Mark, the public finances of emerging markets and developing economies are exhausted after COVID, and now they're hit again by the war and by the implications of the war in Ukraine, and not only the cost of living squeeze, as we may feel it in advanced economies, but also by very basic things like the potential for true food crisis and hunger in those economies. So we're talking about very important things. Now, when we go around and see what's the private sector doing, what we find is that, well, the public sector, as I said, cannot do as much as needed by far in these countries. The private sector, we have surveyed at Untitled Chapter the asset managers, the top asset managers, which comprise about $50 trillion of assets under management. And what we have found is that just 13% of those assets are linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. We think the opportunity is more than that. And I think that the role of the GISD is precisely to materialize this opportunity. So I think that this is the first point I wanted to make. The role of the private sector here is critical, and the collaboration between the public and the private sector is critical, and at the international level. So there are many things which need to fall into place. This is complicated, but it's achievable, and I think it's a must for the world. Now, what is the GISD Alliance trying to do? Well, this was the initiative of the Secretary General of the United States, and We have wonderful partners like UNDESA, like Social Compact and others who are helping us in moving in the right direction. And the idea is to scale up financing and to do it urgently to emerging markets and developing countries. And again, paraphrasing something you said at Glasgow, we also need to move from the billions to the trillions in this very important space. And the alliance is composed by 30 members who were invited by the Secretary General to champion sustainable development. It includes major companies, not only from the financial sector, but also from the non-financial sector, so that there is a diversity of membership, but the common denominator is championing sustainable development. And what we have been doing for the first few years, since it started in 2019, and Laila has been the chair since the beginning. I joined, in November of last year, has been basically trying to lead from the front, putting in place certain products, certain deliverables, like, for example, a definition of what constitutes sustainable development investment, trying to put in place a model mandate so that there is a good long-term alignment of investors with the sustainable development goals, and also working on the issue of reporting, standards reporting along the lines of SDGs. And this is an area which is very important because there are a number of initiatives in the world now with the creation of the ISSB. And again, one needs to make sure that there is convergence rather than duplication. So these are things that we have done. So that this is phase one. Phase two, in terms of the things we've done, is to develop a number of recommendations for multilateral development banks. And maybe I can go there later. And the third thing is put in place for the third phase, which is to come, something which is ambitious. And that is to have a sustainable infrastructure investment platform that allows for collaboration between the public sector, MDBs, and the private sector in scaling up investment for sustainable development. Maybe I can say something more about this later, but this is one thing which is very difficult, but it's the objective. One thing we've done, I should not forget about that, is we have developed an initiative for an information platform so that investors may see what is the pipeline of sustainable investment projects by country and by sector. Because there is an asymmetry of information which creates market failure. And that's the problem that this platform tried to resolve. And this is something which has also been launched. So that's where we are now.
Fantastic. Okay, so that's a great overview of the core initiatives, where you are, and where, Laila, you brought in your leadership the GISD. But of course, you started by thinking about what are the obstacles for the private sector in developing economies, and what are the obstacles they have in mobilizing private sector investment.
Yeah, and Mark, indeed, the emerging markets, the key obstacle right now is the growing and yawning inequality between emerging and developed worlds. If we just look at the follow the money, in 2020, of the $503 billion that was raised in equity, debt, and blended finance, only 1.2 billion of that went to Africa. And so there's a gross lack of funding and there's a lack of support. The GISD Center for Africa identified three key stumbling blocks. The first was relating to inadequate governance and a lack of political will, and we see that in emerging markets, and particularly those in the population who are most in need have least say in the governance outcomes. Secondly was a lack of data, and we know that what doesn't get managed if there's no history, if there's no quantifiable inputs into default history, we won't see funding. And then the third issue is really around lack of resources, and there is a chronic and congenital lack of resourcing in the emerging markets. So much more help needs to be provided for those emerging markets. Of course, the promise of the SDGs is to leave no one behind. And the biggest concern is really need to ensure that we have transition financing. And what we don't need right now is financial houses, banks, investors, asset managers pulling their money out of emerging markets. We need money to be invested, and it needs to be done in a just transition way. So it's really crucial that that transition process gets considered and gets sort of underpins the growth prospects of these countries.
Okay. Sanda, one of the three issues that Leila just mentioned was around data. And so I wanted to ask you around sustainability reporting and, the importance of convergence from your perspective, and, what are the challenges from where we are today to where we need to get to?
Yeah, and I'll just pick up from actually what you said to kick us off, Mark, and the Secretary General is really about what is the challenge at hand. You started off, Mark, by really illustrating how the SDGs are interlinked. So that's the first. Second is they give this promise of leaving no one behind. Third, we've also heard of what the current financing gap is and the need for that public-private financing blend and approach towards resolving some of these pressing issues. So what does that mean for private sector if it does want to get engaged? I mean, the ambition is really high, and with ambition has to come credibility and accountability. So I think it's absolutely paramount that we do have transparent and credible reporting from private sector actors, irrespective. But where do we find ourselves in an era where there has been lots of great discussion around what a robust and relevant and transparent reporting framework should be? There has been, one school of thought of focus purely on financial metrics, but at the same time, we know that the SDG frameworks and certainly the challenges we face today, from investing in pandemic response to investing in the rebuild of Ukraine to investing in other macro issues, is really an interconnected sustainable development issue. So you do need a robust and credible reporting framework. So that, there's the debate between, are we looking at only financial metrics or are we going broader? Certainly, I think, the school of thought is towards broader, much more holistic reporting. As you mentioned, the ISSB is leading efforts around, consolidating actors on reporting, but at the same time, there are different reporting frameworks coming to bear. So we're still faced with a myriad of opportunities around how and where to report. There's also regulated reporting requirements versus voluntary reporting, and what should companies do. At the same time, I think at the core of really, sustainable and responsible business is that it should actually be voluntary. I mean, we are trying to say that business should do what is right, and what is right also is generally good. But, we're getting to the stage where regulation is needed. I mean, you work in the climate space, and I think certainly a lot there has had to have been driven by regulation and standards and urgency and needs. And so I think, the final piece for me around what the roadblock side really is reporting something that has to be purely regulated, or are we looking at businesses to simply do good? And what does this mean for business leadership? What does it mean for investors who want to invest in companies? And certainly, what does it mean for business as a whole? But I do think the convergence that we're seeing right now is good. I do think if I put on my previous hat working in the private sector, though, I do think we need less complex reporting frameworks. Businesses are faced with a myriad of reporting requirements, and you simply cannot have to meet a regional, perhaps, regulation, a national regulation around reporting, an industry-based regulation around reporting. So how do we also simplify what these reporting frameworks may be and avoid the multiplicity that may arise?
Very good. So volunteer, converge, and simplify in that order. Okay, excellent. So shifting from some of these challenges, and actually, you quite nicely, Sanda, started to move to part of how to overcome some of these obstacles. But Leila, if I can come back to you and think about what actions the Alliance has started to take so that businesses financial institutions start to align their business model. And, I was struck by the figure you referenced of, I think 13% of assets had some alignment with the SDGs, or even had some sense, maybe not even alignment, but was beginning to be managed in that direction might be a better depiction of it. So what do we do? What are some of the actions that you've recommended?
Yeah, indeed, Mark, there's a lot to be done. And in fact, in that same report, less than 50% of those companies surveyed saw sustainable investment as mainstream, which is pretty alarming in the current day and age. So the UN put out a report called Renewed, Recharged and Reinforced, and they identified a number of things that need to be done. I'm just going to pick out a couple of them. The first is something very close to my heart, and that is fixed, flawed reporting and mandates and aligned standards. Now, a lot has been done, and there are some very good standards starting to emerge. The ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, recently in March put out a very good report. However, there's a lot of work to be done in aligning and building a double materiality lens through which that reporting and that measuring comes through. Mark, you and I were working on the UN Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, where together with the LSE Group CEO, we put out a global reporting standard recommendation. The JSE, the company for which I work, recently put out a recommendation both for climate and for sustainability reporting, and it's been tremendously well received. Now, I think what is required is a global standard with local areas of national discretion that reflect the contextual differences, because typically what you see, and I'm sorry to bang on about the emerging market drum, is that most of these global standards tend to take the developed world perspective, and the emerging market perspective is not always reflected in those standards. So standards are a very important part. The second action that was suggested is be bold and act now. Now, that same Standard Chartered report had a very good proposal, which was to create tax incentives for sustainable behavior, which I think is a very good approach. South Africa itself has allocated 24 billion rand towards infrastructure financing, and Kenya, in their stewardship code, have also supported very strongly allocating of capital. The GISD Sustainable Investment fund, which Jose spoke about earlier, is going to be an important blended finance structure to enable funding and channel funding, and I'm sure he'll speak a little bit more about that later. And then finally, committing to the long term. It's really important that each country and policymakers embed in their structures measures and incentives that incentivize the long term. As early as 2011, South Africa embedded in its Pension Fund Act the requirement that pension funds consider ESG. And so those are probably just a couple of some of the initiatives and some of the actions. But I think it's certainly gaining momentum. It's accelerated through and post-COVID, hopefully post-COVID. And I think much more needs to be done in being bold, acting now, and focusing on the long term.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, the tailoring for emerging markets, you must keep banging that drum. It's absolutely essential. But also, you remind me again with the example of the ESG, the mandate you just referenced. Of course, South Africa was also a leader in integrated reporting, as led by the JSE. So a lot of the most impactful ideas and applications are starting in the emerging and developing world, and then being mainstream. Okay, so we've touched on this, Jose, a couple of times, just lightly, on interaction with the MDBs, and something you know well. So if how can we get scale? How can we leverage the risk-bearing capacity of the MDBs to really crowd in big multiples of private credit?
Well, MDBs are an essential partner in this public-private sector cooperation. And we heard the Secretary General ask before for an increase in the capitalization of MDBs. We know that these things are complicated. But again, I think this is something that needs to be on the agenda. We're doing something more modestly, but still is not easy, which is engaging with MDBs on two fronts. One is on the basis of a report that we provided to make a series of recommendations within the realm of the feasible, should we say, for MDBs to work within their existing capital structures in order to increase their impact. Things, for example, like standardizing their blended finance structures. I mean, we are one of the largest sort of users of blended finance internationally. And what we find is that there is not sufficient standardization in the use of blended finance. And there is much that could be gained even at the level of ambition which exists today, if there was a standardization of the blended finance structures. Another thing, which has to do also with correcting some asymmetrical informations, had to do with the MDBs publishing aggregated data by country regarding the track record of countries in repaying the loans which are extended to them by multilateral development banks, something which is not as public and as available as one might think. And then we also make a number of recommendations in terms of things that the MDBs could do in order to think more of the words and the concept of co-funding and co-investment, which means working more with the private sector. And I can tell you that over the years, we have been working, for example, with the International Financial Corporation, most specifically, to bring to them creative ideas, and a number of them have borne fruit, but we would like this to be done on larger scale. So these are some of the recommendations that we have provided by the MDBs, and we have one group which is focusing on this engagement, and we're very fortunate to have here in the room also key members of our alliance who are helping with this group, so with this work. So thanks to you. The second type of engagement is the one which is more ambitious, because it raises the bar. And that has to do with the concept of this sustainable infrastructure development platform, which basically tries to scale up the sort of things that we do, let's say, at the retail level, but do it at the wholesale level. And we participate with other investors and with governments in bringing sustainable projects to be bankable with the help of multilateral development banks, and then those projects are financed. That's the use of blended finance that we know. But the question that the GISD is trying to address is, can we put in place, and we are not the only ones trying to move in this direction, so this needs to be part of a concerted effort, can we put in place structures, platform structures, that somehow bring together or align the incentives of the private sector, which is to get a reasonable risk-adjusted rate of return, and the public sector, which is to multiply the impact of their capital without putting at risk their rating, let's call it that way. And can we devise a financial legal framework which create this platform so that we can have multiple MDBs and multiple institutional investors co-funding sustainable development projects in emerging markets and developing economies. And this is something that would be done in a way which is more efficient, scalable, replicable regarding what we have today. Now, this is the dream. This is the objectives. I think it's within reach, but it's very difficult. You need two things. You need a good design that tries to approximate those incentives of the different parties as much as possible, and then you need the political buy-in which is necessary. And that's difficult, because as we know, multilateral development banks are governed by national stakeholders, and each of them is of a different persuasion. So the question is, can we bring the minds to meet on the basis of a solid technical design, and we're going to appoint a world-class asset manager to develop this special purpose vehicle supporting this platform? Can we bring the alignment of the political views so as to put something like this in motion? As I said, it is not easy, it's complex, it's very challenging, it's not impossible, but it requires a lot of work, persuasion, and a little bit of luck.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay. Sanda, maybe I'll ask you about another type of buy-in. You were just talking about political buy-in. I want to ask about buy-in from the corporate sector and what's needed, what actions needed to accelerate the implementation of of sustainable finance principles by companies.
Yeah, and I'll speak about that perhaps a little bit more also from the perspective of the Global Compact where I work. But the first thing is that I think there's a lot of great corporations doing some really good work, but clearly it's not enough. If you heard about it from the asset piece, only 13% of assets are aligned to SDGs. If we look at the gap that we've talked about, that is now the 4 trillion plus mark, I think there's a lot more certainly that corporations can do. And a couple of things that we hear from our business membership, first of all, really is that perhaps, one of the biggest challenges about sustainable financing and financing for development per se is that maybe we need to, I'll go back to simplification, simplify the jargon. What is it that we're aiming to achieve that makes sense for corporates, that gives them, and expressing that ROI for corporates in a way that does make sense? I think that is actually probably one of the first roadblocks that we do hear from time to time, lack of clarity on what an ROI might be around a sustainable investment. I think that's the first. The second, and GISD is doing this, is the development of the platform where you can see what these bankable projects look like and sort of matching need with demand and putting the two together, I think is one of the things that's really important. At the Global Compact, we've developed a task force for chief financial officers where we aim to actually really bring, asset owners, asset managers, investors, CFOs into really discussing what sustainable finance and sustainable financing concepts look like. And we found lots of value in just sitting around, trying to understand what these challenges and roadblocks are. And a couple of things have emerged that we've seen as 4 concrete areas for action. I mean, the first is really having clarity around what a sustainable finance investment and impact looks like. I think that's been really important. Secondly is really looking at how this can then be reflected and communicated within corporations, and particularly with boards where there tends to be slightly what they found, pockets of resistance. And I think thirdly is really just demonstrating to investors and shareholders and stakeholders that there is certainly value in investing in the SDGs. And I do think with the current crises that we have seen that in certain areas. I think we just need to do more and amplify the work that's being done.
Fantastic. Okay, so we're now to the last section of the moderated bit. I guess I'm moderating you as well, but moderated bit up here, which has to do with more, doing more. And effectively, what I want to ask, Sandra, I'm going to go back to you first and say what more can be done with companies. I'm going to ask Leila, what more can the Alliance do? And then Jose, what more can be done with other actors in this area? And is there prospect for convergence and making the sum greater than the parts? So, Sandra, please.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on one element that perhaps I haven't spoken about, which is really what is the framework for risk analysis and the environment around which we can de-risk to allow private sector, and actually it might even apply to public sector, to invest more in areas where the SDGs, where SDG-related investments are needed. I think Leila spoke to it, that, and I'll bang the emerging and developing markets drum as well. I think there is a need for, great private sector investment in a lot of these markets, but their risk profiles aren't necessarily very favorable. So I think a review and a refresh around sort of risk analyses and how we can de-risk environments to make investments more profitable, I think would be of value at this point in time.
Fantastic. Okay. Leila?
Yeah, I think it's all around encouraging targeted disclosure and target impact investing. So we're not just talking about financial and economic outcomes, but we're talking about systemic and double materiality outcomes. There's an importance to start looking more at long-termism and making sure that infrastructure investment, which has a long line of vision, is really focused on that long line. And then real-world impacts is very important for us. So data gaps need to be addressed, need to be considered. And then what we have started to do but need to do a lot more of is collaboration with other stakeholders. So Jose and I met just before this meeting, just talking about the importance of communicating in country with all of the 30 GISD members, of communicating a lot more effectively with multilaterals to ensure that we've got more alignment and more communication. And just to close on my favorite topic, more focus on and emerging markets. Bang, bang.
Bang, bang, good, good. Jose, how do we all work together
And
better?
that is very well received at Standard Charter, where we are an emerging market band, so
We're emerging
really-
market buyers.
really very much in sync. I think you have really covered much of what I wanted to say. I would just say one thing, which is that in addition to engaging from the private sector with the public sector for the sort of things that we have discussed, I think that we in the private sector need to lead by example. And we are 30 members of the alliance, and I think that we need to preach the virtues of sustainable development and what are the things that need to be done in order to reach those goals and close the financing gaps. And coming back to something I said earlier, things like, for example, are we aligning and helping other sort of private sector institutions align their model mandates in line with the long-term aims of the Sustainable Development Goals? Are we really incorporating into our investment sort of principles the sustainable development definition that we have created? I mean, the members of the alliance need to spread the gospel and need to reach out as much as possible to the private sector. That's something we need to do ourselves. And then I think that the issue of collaboration, to me, the world of not only of the MDBs, but also the donors, the sort of development finance institutions, which can play a very important role, things like DFID in the United Kingdom, or SIDA in Sweden, or other national agencies which have significant amounts of money for development. Those are the ones that can also come in these sort of platforms in order to provide some of the de-risking between the multilaterals and the private sector. So I think that there is a lot of engagement going on a number of domains, and we just have to, to do our best in raising the bar.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, now let me open it up for questions, comments, and I'm going to start at the back. And we've got more or less on time. Yes.
Thank
yeah,
you. Jonathan
okay.
Wong from the United Nations
Yeah.
Commission for Asia and Pacific. I'm just curious that I don't see a government official on the panel, but I'd welcome your views on actually what do you think government should do to incentivize kind of investments with both profit and purpose? Thank you.
Yeah, former government official doesn't count. But, although I guess we weren't really government. Who'd like to take a stab?
I'm
Leila,
happy
please.
to jump in on some of them. I think, firstly, tax incentives would go a long way. Secondly, post-COVID, the bailout and the focus on trying to help certain sectors in industry, some Nordic countries have put in requirements for low-rate loans for airlines to ensure that they have a targeted and specific carbon emission reduction. So I think there are a number of really practical things, and it all comes back to contextual dynamics and problems within each country. Within our country, for example, and most emerging market countries, so the S of ESG is profoundly important. So capacity building, focusing in on skills development relating to renewable energy and ensuring that there is a smooth transition and we avoid the problem of stranded assets, unemployment, and therefore livelihoods effectively in emerging markets is addressed, is really critical. So I think that there is also a very important public-private sector coalition of the willing required. It's neither public sector nor private sector's exclusive obligation or domain, but there needs to be more interconnectivity in those initiatives.
May I add to what Leila said, which I think is spot on, which is that governments in potentially recipient of sustainable development funds need to be more proactive than they are in identifying sustainable projects, sustainable investment projects. And for example, we are absolutely not only open, but encouraging those national governments to say, okay, based on workable definition of what sustainable development investments are, and now we have this definition at the GISD, come to us with ideas of projects that you believe meet these requirements for sustainable development projects, and then we'll work with you to make them bankable. We'll work with private insurance, we'll work with other investors, we'll work with multilaterals so that we make this bankable and we achieve the financing that you need in order to move forward. So I think that this proactiveness of recipient countries is extremely important for all the reasons that Leila said, and a number of the things you said are also relevant for advanced economies which want to sort of favor this type of investments. But there is also something else that the recipient countries need to do in addition to what you signal.
What I'm going
If I could add
yeah,
that,
please, yeah.
just, above and beyond also government proactivity, I'd actually add an ambition. And I think, I just want to zero in on the climate piece, for example, because I think one of the biggest challenges we do face, and, private sector, again, I'll speak for our business membership, just feel that government is not being ambitious enough in terms of what it's calling for, what standards it's setting, and therefore lifting also private sector ambition as well. So I do think proactivity, great, layer in some ambition to really get us to some of the big issues that we need to address as a whole between the public and private sectors.
Okay, so I'm going to be ambitious here. I'm going to take 3 in a row and then let you choose from them. But we will answer all 3 of you first, sorry. There's a microphone in the front row. Mr. Bagri, please, yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Apoor Bagri, I'm actually a director of the Hong Kong Exchange, but I also chair London Business School, and London Business School and business schools are doing a lot of work in this area. So, Jose, 30 members in the alliance, and I want to be provocative. 30 members in the alliance. How's that 30 going to become 3,000 and 30,000? My worry when I listen is that we are going to remain behind the curve. And the scale of what is needed is so great, and the time horizon in which this work needs to be done is actually quite short. What is it going to take to create a paradigm shift in the way people think and approach this topic? Is it actually going to be a case where we have to get to the ultimate consumer, us as public, and actually affect the way we think and then use our capacity to change decisions across a political and corporate spectrum? That's the question that I'm trying to sort of struggle with.
Okay. Cindy Levy, please. No, something about paradigm shifts, actually.
Cindy Levy of McKinsey. There was a very brief mention of potential regulatory action in the discussion. And my question would be, for those that regulate capital providers, is there scope for regulation? And if so, on what dimensions could that actually be impactful?
Okay, great. And then one more in this batch, and we'll try and get one more in if we can. Yeah.
Great. Jay Collins from Citi. First of all, thank you for all the amazing work that you've been doing. I was just actually, when I raised my hand, going to comment on what more governments can do, and I'd just say a couple things. One is that we don't blend nearly enough because the ODA organizations aren't structured or mandated to blend, and we should be tripling, quadrupling the amount of blend, and that means fundamentally reorienting those organizations to be able to blend. Second, we should support the SEC on everything that we can do that our report called for in terms of mandatory disclosures, and we're on the pathway there. We just need to move and make sure that that actually happens. Third, and I think critical in this, is that we have an emerging markets debt problem that is not only massive, but it's going to get worse, and we're going to head into COP27 fundamentally with monetary normalization that will disrupt everything in this room that we expect and hope to do. And until the G7 get their arms around what they're going to do for Article 6, which can include bilateral, if not Paris, debt forgiveness that is part of debt swaps, that crowds in and is outcome-oriented, I think the only way that you can get the world good with the official world, with the kind of debt relief that's going to be necessary, is to link it to outcomes, is outcome bundle. And we can do that, and we can do that in scale, because if you crowd in the official sector, you can, in loan and bond format, bundle an enormous amount more of financing, and it's credit enhancing.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Jay, and thanks for your service in the GISD over the years as well. Okay, so we have Paul's question about what does it take to scale, Cindy's about regulatory bite and capital. I'm simplifying the question. 3,000, 30,000.
300,000?
300,000. I'm looking at you, co-chair.
Yeah. Well, I would make 2 comments on the questions. First of all, I wanted to thank Jay from Citi, who's been a fantastic contributor to the Alliance and has been leading some of our work. So kudos to you for the fantastic work that you have been doing and that you continue to do and you will do in the future. So we count on you. Why 30? You have to start somewhere. And, there were 12 apostles, then became several, billion people in the world. Here there are 30. And the 30 are the ones which are getting together in order to put forward some ideas. So it's very difficult to do it with a very large group. You have to start from a small group. But you put ideas in place, and then the Alliance is actually going to expand a little bit. But it's very important that we continue to make it manageable. And I think it's more important the power of persuasion and explaining and developing good ideas and good products than enlarging the number at this stage. You will have many people not necessarily joining the Alliance, but basically implementing the ideas of the Alliance. This is where I would like to see 30,000, 300,000, whatever. That's one thing. One very small comment on the financial regulation. I don't know if to leave this to Mark. My view has always been that financial regulation is for other things. I don't think it's there to solve the climate change problem. I don't think it's there to solve the sustainable development problem. I think that for sustainable development, I would rather go to other type of incentives, for example, some tax incentives, rather than sort of recalibrating regulation. And of course, when we think of tax incentives for this type of thing, one needs to think of how targeted, how timely, and also how temporary they are. Because if you want to advance investment over time, then you have to take into account of the time dimension as well. But let me stop there.
Do you have a quick word? Yeah.
Very quickly. So again, just to reinforce, thank you, Jay. Your support is really appreciated. On Paul's question, I think the point here is to bring 30 influential symbolic leaders to create a compounding effect. And that compounding effect means that each of those have to take back to their country and create an influential network. On the financial regulation, an alternative view is, as we have in Companies Acts across the world, that everybody reports the same interpretation of profit under IFRS. For example, I foresee that there is likely to be a mandating of global disclosures, and those global disclosures need to be globally aligned and also country-specific. Fully support the tax-related measures. In emerging market countries, there are a number of initiatives which mandate and require countries to skills build. In South Africa, we have a legislation around Black economic empowerment, which is really all around investing in the social dynamic and those previously disadvantaged. And so governments can reward companies who are spending money and investing in skills building, in literacy, in capacity building relating to renewables. And I think finally there's a softer issue, which is perhaps shifting away from the reliance, and this is a contentious issue that big government has on carbon-related companies for their elections and for their political positioning, and shifting towards more renewable companies as sources of funding as those industries grow.
Okay, we're down to 5 minutes. I saw a couple waving little hands. What I'm going to propose is a couple quick questions, but you have options. You have full optionality as panelists. You can either answer one of these questions or give your final comments at the end, and then we'll come. So, yeah.
Mark Kahn, not to be confused with Mark Carney, Investec. So I think you may well have seen that Elon Musk this week tweeted ESG is a scam, followed by a rant about how Exxon has done so well, and Tesla didn't appear anywhere, and so forth. Now we also think of it, one can find that humorous, but it is alarming that one of the greatest entrepreneurs and most innovative minds, pushing some of the most extraordinary businesses, puts a tweet out like that. Should we not take it as a little bit of feedback for the way in which we're organizing ourselves in terms of the metric-based bureaucracy that the ESG sort of framework offers companies like Exxon over Tesla to produce an outcome like that? And I'd love your comments on that.
Okay, I'll give a very quick comment, which is that Elon Musk also thinks that securities regulation is a scam, and so it does have a bit of context there. Okay, I think that's probably all the time we have. Did you have a very quick?
It's be quick.
Yeah, very quick, and then you can shoot. You can comment on
very
Elon
quickly.
or
Hugh Van Steenis. How would you scale up the development banks to deliver more? And in particular, at COP26, I thought it was very disappointing they didn't do more around climate. What else could they do there?
Okay. All right. Last words. Sanda, I'm going to start with you.
I won't respond directly to the scam question, but what I'll just say is, look, there's ESG frameworks, and then there's the SDGs, and the real, the world in which we're trying to leave no one behind. And I think it's really important to, as you say, yes, separate the metrics and what lies behind those metrics, but also the power of what the private sector can do. And I think a company that is robust and really does invest in the SDGs will be more, the impact of it is going to be much broader than a set of ESG dynamics. So I think those sort of comments for me are very mono-visioned. I think really what we're calling for in companies and the reporting and the transparency is really what they do and what the actions are, not so much reporting in and of itself as an end. And I think that's what's really critical. What we're calling for is action, not great reports. And that for me is where I just find the sort of the debate falls a little bit short, or the tweet falls a little bit short. It's not the metrics, it's the actions and the transformation.
Jose?
Well, what can global banks do in order to scale up their financing of things like net zero and sustainable development? Well, I think there is one very important thing, which is conviction and believing in the importance of this. For us, at Standard Chartered, this is very easy, because we live in the realities of emerging markets and developing economies. We understand what this market needs, and also understand the huge commercial opportunity that exists. So in a way, it's very simple to pursue our purpose through our profit, and it's very easy. I know that there is recently been noise about how sincere are international banks about their commitment to net zero, and if you want to extrapolate to sustainable development. I can speak for myself, for the bank. I think that for us is a no-brainer.
And finally, I'd say on the Elon Musk tweet, in fact, it aligns with the point I was going to make, which is the importance of social. One of the key reasons that Tesla was removed was the social shortfalls. Firstly, there were a number of accidents that occurred and deaths that occurred because the control systems in the cars weren't appropriate. And secondly, there was a significant shortfall in the way in which staff were treated in the organization. And I think this really just rounds back to the importance of the E, the S, and the G. One cannot focus exclusively on one of those dynamics. One has to very tentatively balance the social with the climate. And you can't have climate without social, and you can't have social without climate. And it's rather an irony that this tweet came from a person whose country of birth of South Africa, where the social complexities and the social needs are of such a high level. And so I'd really just close to say social and climate change are really important. So just transition is absolutely critical if we're to achieve net zero.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a wonderful way to end what's been, from my perspective, a fascinating discussion and an impactful discussion. So everything connected, the importance of all elements of all 17 elements of the SDGs in order to achieve in a durable fashion any of the SDGs. And what the GISD is doing is putting in place the frameworks, the actions, the standards, and leading by example around these to have that compounding effect that poll provoked, and the panel responded. So if you could just join me in brief show of appreciation for the three.